Aloha, and welcome everyone to the second topical session in the U.S.-Japan Council's virtual 2020 public symposium titled NPO Sustainability, Leadership Succession Strategies. I'm Norman Nakasone. I work for Central Pacific Bank in Honolulu, and I'm a member of the USJC's Board of Directors. I first want to take this opportunity to thank our many sponsors and promotional partners for your support of the U.S.-Japan Council and this symposium. I would like to offer our sincere appreciation to our platinum sponsor, FABIT, and to our other platinum sponsor, the Ford Foundation. I would also like to thank our title sponsors, Central Pacific Bank Foundation, Hitachi, Itoen, Mitsui & Company, MUFG Union Bank, the Terasaki Nibe Foundation, and Toyota Research Institute. I would also like to thank our signature sponsors, which you can see displayed on this slide. We are so grateful for your support in helping make programming like this possible. And to the many companies and individuals who make up our premier sponsors, we truly appreciate your generosity. We're proud of this fantastic group of supporters and couldn't be here without you. Our gold sponsors can be seen on this slide, and would like to once again thank each and every one of you for your continued support, especially through this most challenging year. Finally, I would also like to thank our promotional partners for this session, whose logos can be seen on the screen. This is a topic that is really near and dear to my heart. I've been involved with the Hawaii United Okinawa Association, or HUOA, here in Hawaii since the early 2000s. Leadership succession is something that has always been top of mind for HUOA as long as I can remember, and it still is. The process of identifying potential leaders, getting them involved, keeping them engaged, and grooming them for their time is an ongoing process. As I look back in time, I guess I was one of those young potential leaders back in the day that my many senpai groomed over the years. Almost 20 years later, I'd like to think I'm doing my part in helping groom the young leaders of today. You'll be hearing from one of them, Lynn Miyahira, current president of HUOA, as one of the panelists this morning. I'm looking forward to hearing what her take on succession planning is at HUOA, as well as what fellow panelists Jeff Moy and John Osaki have to share about their own organizations. And so, without further ado, I'd like to turn the program over to our moderator and my buddy, Craig Ishii. Craig is an integrated marketing communications manager at Beckman Coulter and a USJC associate member who is a 2013 alum of the Emerging Leaders Program. He helped pilot the first workshop in this NPO Sustainability Series at the 2019 annual conference in LA, which focused on fundraising, board governance, organizational evaluation, and next generation leadership. He's here now with a group of Japanese American community organization leaders to take a deep dive into multi-generational leadership succession for long-term sustainability. Craig, take it away.
My pleasure. Thank you for the introduction, Norman. We hope everyone's having a great day, a great morning, a great afternoon. We appreciate you being here with us this day. I am going to go ahead and share my screen very quickly here because we're going to be using slides for today's presentation. Again, we hope everyone's having a great afternoon. And with that, we're going to go ahead and jump in. Our team has been working very hard to provide you with today some perspective, insight, and hopefully some key takeaways as you consider transitioning the leadership of your nonprofit organization. But before I begin, and I know we usually do this at the end, but when you're on webinars, sometimes people have to drop off a bit early, sometimes people have to go. So I actually wanted to put some of my special thank yous at the beginning of today's workshop before we introduce our panelists. So just bear with me very quickly. A first special a special thank you does go out to Shane Graves. Shane has been our primary conference liaison. I think he's really been everybody's panel conference liaison. He's really made the last several days happen. He's probably blushing a little bit, but Shane, I know you're listening. We just want to give a big thank you we've been talking with you, planning with you for months. I know it's been just tons and tons and tons of work. So thank you so much for all your time. And we're really a success today because of your hard work. And the second special thank you, I do want to give out to Colbert Matsumoto. As Norman had mentioned last year with USJC, it was really him and Kazmaniwa that started the discussion around having USJC support a space for nonprofits to begin to think about their futures. And so it was really with his leadership that last year's panel happened, where we talked about a number of different topics. This year, we're honing in us the specific topic of leadership succession. And so again, providing that folks don't completely hate today's workshop, hopefully we can continue to do this in future years. But again, Colbert, just wanted to say a special thank you if you happen to be out there as well. Now, with that, we can go ahead and get started. But before we jump into some of the stories and really the meat and potatoes of today's workshop, you've seen from the many workshops that we've had so far and some of the ones that are coming up is that there is really kind of a through line and a common theme as we look at each of our workshops. And that theme has been along the lines of legacy and resilience. And so when we look at our nonprofits, they're very much part of that legacy, very much part of that community resilience over the many, many, many years. Our nonprofits are really the backbone, they're the framework of our success as a community. They're the foundation of our identity. And really the great part is that they're able to bring all of our brains together in sort of like a hive mind to strategically think and vision for the future. So before we begin, Shane had asked me to really contextualize today's workshop within a larger framework of that history. So bear with me, it's going to be a little bit of a monologue. You're going to have to hear me for another 4.5 minutes or so, but we thought it was important to provide just a bit of history. So I'm going to do that right now from a nonprofit perspective. So in the beginning, out of a need for cultural preservation, out of a need for building community, the first wave of immigrants created some of our first community organizations. We saw organizations like Buddhist temples being formed in the late 1800s. Colbert had mentioned to me that one of the first kendo demonstrations that was done for King Kalakaua was done by a cultural practitioner who came in the first wave of immigrants from Japan to Hawaii. Jeff Moy, who is one of our panelists today, is representing the Japanese American Citizens League. That organization was founded in 1929 as a civic participation organization. It still exists today. And of course, that is also the time period when we saw some of the formation of our ethnic enclaves, like the one that you're seeing here. Little Tokyo in the late 1800s, San Francisco, Japantown, the late 1800s, San Jose's Japantown. There's also Japantown International District in Seattle. And that's really even just a small fraction of the number of different Japantowns that were formed along the West Coast during that time. Again, not necessarily out of community building, some of it out of ethnic discrimination, but this is really the beginning of our community, the beginning of some of our organizations that would become some of our stalwart nonprofits in the community. Something that's not quite as known, including to myself, I actually didn't learn this until college, is that many of the service organizations, with a few notable exceptions, they were generally founded in the period of the 1970s. So under the Kennedy administration, under the Johnson administration, and specifically under the Great Society program, there was a realization that the government needed to begin to support and provide for our communities most vulnerable. And so that's when we started to see some of the funding available from a federal standpoint for social services. So it's not a coincidence that when we look at organizations like Little Tokyo Service Center, one of our panelists, John, represents the Japanese Community Youth Council, also formed in 1970. Kimochi in San Francisco in 1970. There's an organization in Chicago, the Japanese American Service Committee. They were founded post-war, but in my conversation with their executive director, Michael Takada, he had mentioned to me that it was really the 60s that they began to ramp up the service arm of the organization. So it's not a coincidence that those services began to pop up during this decade. But the interesting part is that we started to see a new generation of leaders begin to take the helm. Whereas Issei and Nisei were some of our original founders in that last slide, we began to see some of our sansei step up into the role of leaders. Moving to the 80s and early 90s, there became a sophistication that was developed in many of our nonprofits. What started to happen is that federal funding that I had mentioned in the last slide, a lot of that began to be passed on and really what we call devolved, devolution, became devolved down to the state and county level. And so the work to manage the money, to get the money became a little bit more complex. And so that complexity also began to develop within nonprofits. But during this time, we also saw a critical period where our Nisei and Issei were establishing wealth. And they began to think about their legacy. So in this very low pixel resolution photo that you're seeing here, this is an interview from the Hanashi Oral History Project that Go for Broke had kicked off. And they were founded in the late 80s. The Japanese American Museum of San Jose was founded in the late 80s. The Japanese American National Museum was formed in the early 90s. It's not a coincidence that this period saw the founding of this layer of legacy organizations because of that wealth, and also because of that desire to think about how are we passing on values and stories to the next generation. And so that is really the context for today's workshop, because really it was the 90s and early 2000s that we saw the community presented with a pretty significant challenge. From the stories that I was told, Regis had been accomplished in 1988 with the signing of the Civil Liberties Act. It was distributed in 1989. And there was a general sense from the community that we're good. We've done what we came to do. Now we can sort of go on living our lives. That's how John had described it to me. And so as the community began dispersing in both physical location and also even mentally, there was a question of survival of Japantowns, a question of survival of organizations, and really, what would the Japanese American community do? Would we eventually just assimilate and disappear, or would we continue to survive and sustain? That was really the question of that time period. And so there was really a push-pull factor that happened in this immediate period before today's workshop. On one side, there was a retooling of organizations. You could see from the photo here, that Norm is speaking at the Nikkei 2000 conference. This was one of many conferences where organizations began to think about how is it that we better market? How is it that we connect with the next generation? How is it that we look at the diversity of our community? And what do we need to do to retool our organizations to be relevant? And the push factor is on the other side. There was also a growing sense of pride and identity. I think the very fear of potentially losing organizations that were in danger became very much an igniting factor in Generation Y or millennials movement to be involved. And so you had this push-pull factor. The interest was there. The programs had begun to be created. This is one of them created by the US-Japan Council called the Emerging Leaders Program, which many of us represent. But now the question became, we have the people, the relevancy is there, and the beginnings of that transition to staffs, committees, and boards are there. But that's really where we find ourselves today. How do we make that full shift from one generation to the next over the period of the next 10 years, the next 20 years? How can we best transition the leadership of our organizations? And so that's the question and the context for today's workshop. I am excited to present 3 stories, 3 perspectives, and a lot of Q&A after they are done. And so with that, I'd like to do some introductions. I am going to first start with Jeff Moy. Jeff is the national president of the Japanese American Citizens League. He is now in his second term, which means that he did something right during his first term. And Jeff has been instrumental in building a whole new board with new ideas, new energy. Jeff, if you are there, tell us a bit about why you're here today.
Thanks, Craig. Yeah, like you said, I'm here just to talk a little bit about my journey with JCL and the board transformation that I've helped to oversee. I also have a background in terms of my work in nonprofit administration and government, so I think that's certainly helpful in these conversations. And of course, I'm here for you, buddy. So thanks for inviting me.
Appreciate that. Appreciate that. Our next panelist and presenter is John Osaki. He is the longtime executive director of the Japanese Community Youth Council in San Francisco. And I had mentioned in a previous slide that there was really a retooling that was done by nonprofits. And much of that community revitalization, John has been at the center of it. So things like the Ties That Bind conference, things like the Nikkei 2000 conference, for decades, John, both as an individual and as an organization, has really modeled not just community diversity, but thought around what it means to be a next generation leader and what community organizations need to do to bring in those people as leaders. John, welcome. Tell us a bit about why you're here today.
Well, thank you, Craig. Thank you, everyone, who's joining us here today. Craig, thanks for mentioning that I'm a longtime executive director.
I just couldn't leave it out. You know, I got to get those jabs in there.
That's okay. That's actually why I am here. I have, I would say, probably a unique perspective. I followed a longtime executive director at my organization who had been there for 23 years. Like many who are on this panel and probably joining us here today, I started off as the young guy. I was a 29-year-old executive director when I took over, and that was 24 years ago. So our organization kind of has both the good and bad history of having a total of 3 executive directors in our 50-year history. So, you know, we have some perspective on succession, and I also serve on probably more boards than I should. So that's why I'm here.
Thank you so much. And our final presenter, Lynn Mihira, as Norman had mentioned at the beginning, she is the current president of the Hawaii United Okinawa Association, or the HUOA, and she's really been part of a very intentional movement by that organization to look at its demographics, to look at its membership, to look at its leadership. And Lynn has really been a leader at the forefront. And so Lynn, welcome. Tell us about why you're here today.
Thanks, Craig. I know that, like Norman said, yes, I am part of the reason why I'm here today is both Craig and Norman. But thank you to them. Like Craig said, it is kind of an intentional movement that we are looking to consistently identify, groom, and bring up new leaders. And I think that's what I'll be sharing about the Hawaii United Okinawa Association today. But just wanted to say thank you. Also very happy to be representing our Hawaii. You know, we have a unique situation, I think, out here. Our history kind of parallels a lot of ways of West Coast and all the different, you know, Nikkei communities around the country. But we do have a huge population here. And I think that does give us a little bit of a different dynamic. So I'm very happy to talk about that today too.
Awesome. So this is what we're going to do. We've got 3 stories. We're going to start with Jeff. We're then going to move to John. We're then going to move to Lynn. And then we've got a lot of Q&A and a very, very, very deep dive at the end of today's session. So with that, Jeff, I'm going to pass it over to you. Let's hear a bit about your story.
Great. Thanks, Craig. So again, I'm Jeff Moy. I'm the current JCL National President. And as Craig mentioned, JCL was founded in 1929. It's the oldest and largest Asian American Pacific Islander civil rights organization in the country. We've got, you know, about 100 chapters across the country. We also have a Japan chapter. And because of that, our membership base is extremely diverse, right? We've got people who live all over the country. They have different political views. They come from different generations. Some people grew up with JCL in their lives because of family members who had been involved. Others, like myself, didn't learn about JCL until later in life. So I joined JCL in 2009. I had moved to DC from after going to college at USC, and I was looking for ways to engage with the Asian American community there, you know, in a new city. And I joined up with JCL, and because of that, I kind of gone from someone who didn't know anything about nonprofits to national president in less than a decade. So about a year after becoming a JCL member, I attended the JCL OCA Leadership Summit in the spring of 2010. This is the photo that you're seeing here. And this is an annual program that's jointly organized with OCA, which is another Asian American civil rights organization. And this for me was my crash course in civil rights and advocacy work. We did Hill visits as part of the summit, and it introduced me to people from across the country who were doing this work in their communities. And this was a life-changing event for me. I ended up leaving my private sector job at the end of that year. I've worked in nonprofit organizations ever since, including working for OCA, which was my first nonprofit job. So after I went through this summit, I was looking for other ways to plug in to JCL, and I joined the National Youth Student Council. This is a group of students and young professionals around the country, and they were just starting to ramp up their programming, including their own series of summits. So here's a picture of the first NYSC summit in the fall of 2010 in San Francisco. So I spent a few years working with the NYSC, and it really solidified my commitment to the JCL. One of our most memorable summits was centered on environmental justice in New Orleans in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. It was a way for us to learn from the Vietnamese American community. And experiences like this, right, as a young professional, having the opportunity to travel around the country with a really tight-knit group of people, volunteering, you know, doing trainings with other young people was really special. So JCL's national board is made up of 15 voting members, 2 of which are reserved for National Youth Student Council members. And those 2 seats get elected in the same way that the other officers do, which is at our conventions on even years for 2-year terms. So there had not been a lot of success, I would say, with people transitioning from those youth positions on the board to other positions in the national board, which to some extent makes sense, right? When you have a group of students and young professionals, they may be, you know, they're getting used to their working lives, their first jobs out of school. They may be moving cities, right, after they graduate. So there are a lot of reasons why it's been hard to retain those members in the organization. But I had spoken to some friends, and we decided that we were going to try to keep pushing on in the national board in different ways. So after I was chair of the National Youth Student Council, I ran for vice president for public affairs. I won that seat, and I served 2 terms there. This is a photo of me giving a speech at the rally for refugees at Reagan National Airport in Washington, D.C. in the wake of the Muslim ban in 2017. And so that, you know, and this position brought me a lot of really great opportunities in the organization. And when my 2 terms were up, I decided I would run for national president. So here's a picture of me with some of the other national presidents from the past couple of decades. I will let you draw your own conclusions about the age of folks in this group. But again, I am the youngest president in at least the last, I don't know, 70 plus years in the organization's history. I'm also the first Yonsei president that JCL has had. So this picture by itself clearly doesn't tell the whole story. In order to make the change that I wanted to make in JCL, I knew that we needed to have a truly diverse board in a way that we hadn't seen before. So when I ran for president, I reached out to friends that I had made through all these different positions and activities over the years. Some of these folks had stepped away from JCL over the years, right? Because of things that had come up in their personal or professional life, or because of frustrations that they felt about the organization. But I had a lot of conversations with folks and just asked them if they would be willing to run with me, if we felt like we had an opportunity to really, you know, build a transformative board. I knew a lot of these folks were long shots, but I just tried to have as many conversations as I could leading up to the election. So this was the first board that I was elected with. There are a few people missing here, but half the board are folks in their 20s and 30s, which is something that JCL has never seen before. Gender diversity was also important. We typically see a lot of male leadership in the organization, so I was very happy to see a lot of female representation as well. So we'll get into this more as we talk throughout this, but a few key takeaways I've learned along the way. Board diversity is just really critical. If we want to have creative organizations that are ready to adapt, we need to have a diversity of ideas. And pragmatically, for JCL to be seen as a more desirable organization for people to join or for funders to fund, they want to see a multi-generational board, right? They want to see a place that seems open to all people. To build the bench, you know, with a membership organization like JCL, the bench is actually right there, right? It is our membership base, but it's not, but sometimes what happens is there's a lull and people aren't really being invited into those conversations, or they're just, you know, for whatever reason, those conversations aren't happening. So, you know, again, it was really important to me when I ran for president to have a clear message and ask when I was reaching out to folks to see if they'd be interested in running as well. I was also really open to possibilities. I really knew who I wanted to also run for board positions, but I was happy to also, you know, see if maybe there were other fits in the organization if that wasn't the right thing for them to do at that time. Building trust throughout the process is obviously really critical. You know, I've shown up for JCL conventions every year since 2011. Now, you know, I'm very fortunate to have been able to do that, but being out there, having our members see me year after year, building that recognition is really critical. You know, people understood that I was someone who was going to show up for the organization. And learning, right? There's so much learning to be done. We're so lucky to have so much institutional knowledge in the organization. I know that there's always something new for me to learn about JCL and the history. And again, hopefully folks understand, you know, the value and knowledge that I bring to the table as well. And then throughout all these points, just clear communication is such a must to build that diverse board, to ensure that people feel heard and are ready to cooperate with each other, to really make sure that the bench you're building, that these folks feel valued as a part of the process. You got to be able to clearly communicate. So that's just kind of my quick story here to get us started. Thanks again.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jeff. So, you know, Jeff, we're going to come back to some of the discussion points you had specifically around tactics, trust, et cetera. But before we do that, I do want to welcome our second panelist, Mr. John Osaki, hailing from San Francisco, to give a bit on his background on his time with JCYC and the experiences that they've had with board transition and succession. So with that said, John, take it away.
Well, thank you, Craig. And I wanted to start with a photo of our founder of JCYC, Reverend Ron Kobata. And I think it's just a really important part of our community's history to share how our organization came about. And it was really young people who were involved in the student strikes at San Francisco State and UC Berkeley. Who really felt empowered to make sure that our community was recognized, our histories were recognized, that there was representation. And, you know, quite honestly, the young people who started JCYC did not feel that young people had a voice in San Francisco, Japantown, did not feel that they had any power to have representation, to make sure that the community was taking into account their needs and what they wanted to see happen with the community. And so what these very entrepreneurial young people did was form their own organization. And what Ron did that I think is very telling with regard to what we did with conferences like Nikkei 2000, the Ties That Bind, is Ron brought all the different youth groups together to form a council. That's why today our name is Japanese Community Youth Council, because it did start as a council of young people who could make decisions and start programs that young people wanted. And I don't think it's hard for people to connect with the idea that our community, very well intentioned, but for decades, what young people were able to participate in were largely based upon what adults had decided young people should have. And again, with the very best of intentions. But the void in our community was that young people did not have a place to decide for themselves what was needed in our community. And what you see, the photo you see right now, is one of the very first programs that our organization started. It was to respond to a need, to make sure that at that time there was still a large number of families living in the Japantown area. And it was critical that they had productive activities to participate in during the summer. And so with regard to myself, I am, in many respects, I often describe myself as the ultimate poster child of the organization. That's me right there in the middle, a participant of our summer day camp back in the 70s, when we were a very young, as grassroots as you can be organization. And I think it was just, but I think it was such an important time, because out of the movement to engage young people, to make sure that they were in leadership positions, not only did JCYC start to flourish, but the leaders who started the organization actually started other organizations. So organizations in San Francisco, Japantown, like Kimochi, were started by many of the same young people who started our organization, and they went on to get involved in many other groups in the community. So it was just a very unique time, and not just the history of San Francisco, Japantown, but the entire Japanese community in this country, to have this very unique proliferation of young leadership, really driving change, really driving the involvement of young people in our neighborhood. And so what I'd like to point out about our organization is that I think that everybody here can agree, and Jeff touched upon it earlier, that there's tremendous diversity. And there's tremendous diversity in terms of what we think of as the Japanese American community these days. The majority of the young people that we see are multiracial. And I think that our organization made the decision to evolve in the way that our organization, our community was evolving, the way that the demographics in our community were evolving. So our board, this is from a few years ago, looks very different than probably a lot of other Japanese American nonprofits in the country. And that's very intentional. And I think that we are today, as we speak, making even more concerted efforts to make sure that we have a broad base of representation within our board of directors, not just with regard to ethnicity, but with regard to professionalism, with regard to background, skills, age, of course, gender, and skill sets. And so that's really has been our approach in, forming our board and managing our board. And I think that, I do want to speak to this a little bit later as well, but, I meet with, I see a lot of executive directors who tell me horror stories about working with their boards of directors, that are micromanaging them, there are power struggles between the executive director and the board. And I think that, and I always tell my board that we have never experienced that. And I think that has been really critical to our success as an organization. And I did want to point out that, and I think this is, to me, this is just a wonderful story. And frankly, a no-no for a lot of organizations, but we actually brought our founder back onto the board. And what I wanted to say about that is that at our organization, change is a good thing. Evolution is a good thing. We value constantly being a dynamic organization that is not static, and that is part of what we embrace as a core value of our organization. But at the same time, there came a point in our agency where we were changing so rapidly that I felt it was actually helpful to bring Reverend Kobata back onto our board to really ground us, to remind us why we were formed as an organization, to share stories with us about how the agency came together. And I think that was really helpful in grounding our organization, making sure we remember our roots, how we came about as an organization. And I think it really provided an important balance for us so that we were continuing to evolve and change as an organization, but that we had a very clear lens on what we were about as an organization when we were founded, and what attributes of that are really important to maintain within our organization. And so I want to just spend a little time sharing how we think about our composition as a board. This is our board matrix, and it has it tracks everything from board terms to skill sets, professional background, age, gender, where people live, skill sets. And I think this was just really helpful in helping us think through both what we had as an organization. This is very common on boards where you have people who have these closet skill sets that you never hear about until they're ready to leave the board. And so we wanted to make sure that we knew all the different types of experiences and skill sets board members had that they can contribute to the organization. So this was a way for us to map that, but it was also a way for us to understand what we need. Where are we deficient? What do we need how can we focus our recruitment of board members to make sure that we are addressing very specific needs? And, and I want to make it clear that as an organization, there's been many times when we are more than happy to accept the warm body who was eager and, just enthusiastic about joining our board, who didn't necessarily fit one of these skills. I don't want to paint a picture like we're perfect in this process, but at the same time, it does give us a certain lens about what we need, about what priorities we have in future board recruitment. So I think in that respect, it's been a very helpful tool. So just some of my takeaways, I think, and I spoke to this earlier, is that we think very intentionally about making sure that there's representation of those we serve. And we're certainly not always perfect at that. And it's something that we are constantly working towards to ensure that we have representation on our board of directors. And I just want to speak to a little bit about what I think has been really successful with our board. I think, and something that I've worked with them on, is to ensure that our board members are engaged in the political process. And I don't mean just voting. I mean working with me on ballot measures and supporting candidates, of course, separate from our organization, but being involved in that way where our organization can have a certain degree of influence. And I think that's where board members can be particularly helpful. I think that board members provide a perspective from other sectors. And, it's very easy to recruit a board of very like-minded people with similar backgrounds. But I think for our organization, that's not particularly helpful. We want people with very diverse views, with very diverse perspectives and experiences. And I think that has been incredibly helpful for our organization. And I want to really make this last point because I think has been really important. What I appreciate most about the board of our organization is that they have been very committed to having a strategic role in the organization, that their role is to think strategically. Their role is not to get into the weeds. It is not to micromanage. It is to really think strategically about how the organization can move forward, can grow in a very thoughtful manner, and to operate at a very macro level. And I really want to stress that because I think that has been so important to the functioning of and the relationship between the staff and the board of directors, and it's worked really well. So I'll stop there and let you all move on.
Very cool. You know, we're gonna revisit some of the items that John had mentioned, really specifically also that board recruitment matrix in just a bit. But before we get there, I do want to introduce our last panelists. I'd like to welcome Lynn Miyahira, hailing from Hawaii. She's here to tell us a bit about her background and involvement with the HUOA. Lynn, take it away.
Hi, hang on, sorry. Thank you, everyone. My name is Lynn Miyahira, and I'm with the president of the Hawaii United Okinawa Association. We are a fairly large organization here in Hawaii. Our roots held back to about 1951 when we gathered. We are 50 different member clubs that actually started much earlier than our organization. And that's why we are the kind of the federation of Okinawan different clubs here in Hawaii, and that's why we're called the Hawaii United Okinawa Association. Our mission is to promote, preserve, and perpetuate the Okinawan culture here in Hawaii. So we're very much so a cultural organization. I could do a whole nother webinar on the origin story. It's kind of a post-war relief effort that the Hawaii Okinawa community galvanized together to help support the post-war relief effort in Okinawa. And so, but that's a story for another day. I wanted to talk about, we're talking about board recruitment and board sustainability, but it really does start from the involvement. And much like John and Jeff, I am a product of the many programs that the Hawaii United Okinawa Association has invested in over the years. And this photo is from 1990. So I can say my involvement with HOA started over 30 years ago now. I'm the child in the middle there. My family is going to kill me for putting this up on for the whole world to see. But this is my family's first trip to Okinawa together. And my father, who is kind of directly behind me, was the president of the Hawaii United Okinawa Association the same year. So this was really an eye-opening experience for me and my entire family to really connect with our Okinawan heritage, our roots, and to visit. This was the first worldwide Uchinanchu festival, which has now become a huge once every 5-year event in Okinawa. Unfortunately, they've pushed it back a year because of COVID next year, but this was the first one back in 1990. So because of this, I was also involved in Okinawan dance. Now, as a child, we were able to take Okinawan dance lessons, and this was part of the cultural performing arts, just like other organizations. We look back at our history, and cultural arts and performing arts and day camps and things like that are really a great foundation for building identity, building connection. And I know my sister and my cousin Julie are probably going to kill me for putting this up, but this is when I started Okinawan dance lessons with Yoshiko Nakasone sensei with the Nakasone Dance Academy back in whatever year this was, early 90s, probably late 80s this was. But really, it does take a village to raise a child. And I feel like many of those children are who we identify and groom to come up as leaders in our organization. So another program that I was very involved with as a student, and I'm very grateful to have been a part of, was our Hawaii Okinawa Student Exchange Program. And this was a life-changing moment for me. It was my first, you're in high school and you get to go to Okinawa with a bunch of kids, and it was just a lot of fun, to be very honest. Of course, it was an educational program. I got to go to school in Okinawa as a high school student for 2 weeks or so. And then I will say in this photo, to the right is Tom Yamamoto and Jane Sarikaku, who are also past presidents of the Hawaii United Okinawa Association. So you can see already how we've been able to groom people, since high school. And this opportunity is something that we're continuing to develop, and it's a real exchange. And I think that's what makes this program special. But another way that we are able to kind of move people through the pipeline, I think. So what we did from there, and of course, because of that, I developed a very deep interest in Okinawa, and I was able to do more cultural performing arts. And I came back to Hawaii and I started playing taiko, I started doing karate, and I just got really into it, and I think we see this amongst other people in our organization, and we want to develop that. It kind of deepened my connection to our Okinawan community and gave me more more knowledge of my own heritage, language, music, culture. And I was really lucky to be able actually to go back to Okinawa and get my black belt in Okinawa. But this also got me going through, so we're getting, through the pipeline again. I also had a teaching experience in Okinawa through the Japan Exchange and Teaching Program. And although this isn't necessarily an HEOA program, because of my involvement with HEOA, I was lucky enough to be placed in Okinawa. I wrote a whole nother essay about why I wanted to be placed in Okinawa, and I had all these programs that I had been involved in, and so luckily they accepted my application, and I was really able to build people-to-people connections here. This is one of my first grade classes that I taught while I was in Okinawa. Crazy to me to think that these kids are actually beyond college now, but as I was able to take this experience, learn more about everyday life in Okinawa, and then when I came back to Hawaii, I started talking to a lot of the leaders in the Hawaii United Okinawa Association, including Norman Nakasone, who did our intro today. And this photo right here, there's a lot of people in this photo that I credit with my involvement with the Hawaii United Okinawa Association. So you have Norman here, Dave next to him, Courtney Takara here on the left. I hope she's watching today, but she was president of the HEOA 2 years ago, and she will probably always be the youngest president of the Hawaii United Okinawa Association. I believe she was only 32 at the time. And so what she helped do was pave the way for maybe us trusting that, wow, somebody really young can do this job. And there's all of these people holding the banner here are past presidents. So what happened in 2011 was Norman Nakasone asked me during like a Chinese, we went to dinner somewhere, and he said, hey, I want you to seriously think about joining, HEO leadership. And it was the very next year where I was able to join the board of Cyrus Tamashiro. He's on the far right over here, as an advisor. And so one would not normally think that an advisor is somebody young in their 20s. And so I asked that same question, aren't the advisor positions supposed to be for older folks? And he said, no, we specifically want you. It's a position you can come in, you can learn, you can, we know that you have the cultural background, we know that you've been in the organization for a long time, but this is a chance to really learn about the mechanics, the financials, the things that are really important to board leadership. And so I was an advisor from 2011, 2012, 13, 14. And then by 2016, 2017, I became a vice president. And then I was a vice president from 2016, 17, 18. And then in 2019, I became president-elect, which leads me to being president in 2020. And so you can see that it was basically a 10-year journey of starting as an advisor on the board. And this was January of 2020, when we could still gather in large groups. It was what we call our installation banquet and Uchinanchu of the Year award. And I wanted to just give a quick shout out. I invited all of my USJC family as much as I could bring. And so this was part of, a start of this very exciting year for us. And who knew it was going to be like this? But our current board composition, and actually this is our executive council, is made up of actually a multi-generational executive council. And so if we're looking at our current board, we could go to the next one. We do have a wide range of people, wide skill sets. We're trying to look for that, intentionally bringing in people from various age ranges. So I think Brianne Yamada, who is in the upper left, she's probably youngest at, I want to say she's 27 now. She's 26, 27. We have people all the way up to, I think our oldest member is 76. So about a 50-year, range of different Yonsei, Sansei, and I think some very young Nisei as well. But then different backgrounds in education, lawyers, bankers, let's see, business people in retail, we have people who are insurance, architects, that kind of thing, and a lot of engineers. And so we're trying to make sure that we also keep that kind of diversity in terms of skill sets and types of thinking to our board. And so this is our executive council. Actually, our board is made up of 50 of the club presidents. So it's kind of an umbrella organization. And amongst those people, we have even more diversity in terms of, you know, what people do for a living, professional. We do tend to kind of sit heavier on the older, I call them the retirees and super seniors, but we are definitely seeing a lot of intentional bringing in of new club presidents. And I want to say, and I got to check this because I don't know her exact age, but I know we have a few presidents who are in their young 20s. So definitely making, you know, it's not to say that we're perfect, but we're definitely trying to bring in more people and make the Hawaii United Okinawa Association an organization that really welcomes young people and old people. Actually, I shouldn't say old people, but a wide range. I think the multi-generationalness of our organization is what makes us very strong. All right. So a couple of the takeaways, like John and Jeff had mentioned, creating that pipeline, right? Create programs that involve people at various stages of their life. So whether they're children, and even within children, right? You know, like the younger, much younger, maybe then 3rd, 5th grade, and then you have your junior high and high school, like breaking it up that way. And then intentionally creating initiatives for younger leaders to build trust. Trust is a two-way street, right? So I'm already starting to consider myself probably one of the older people, and we need to bring in people in their 20s and 30s. And how do we build trust? How do I build trust with them so I feel comfortable giving the reins to them? And then start with the why. You know, we got to think about why people stay involved in our organization. What is it that brings them to the table? And, you know, why would somebody donate to us? And making sure that that's at the base of what we're doing. And if anything 2020 has taught us, it's to be flexible and to be nimble. And I think having that breadth of different generations on our board definitely helped us here in 2020 to be flexible, to be nimble, to have, you know, the ability to do new things in a virtual context. And so these are kind of the big takeaways that, especially in 2020, that we've learned as the Hawaii United Okinawa Association. But yeah.
Cool.
So take it away, Craig. Yeah.
Lynn, thank you. Thank you. If I could ask the panelists to just unmute themselves. What we're going to do now, we've got about 24 minutes, 23 minutes, so we might have to kind of zoom through some of these questions here, but we're going to dive into some of the specific topics here, some of the specific tactics. What we wanted to make sure to do for folks who are watching the panel is make sure that you've got the background, you've got the stories. I think we've got three very credible, you know, subject matter experts on board succession. But, you know, what are the specific items and things that we can do with regards to our nonprofits? So that's what we're going to do right now. But before we do that, I want to just present something as a bit of a review that we had discussed last year during our nonprofit sustainability panel, just to kind of contextualize some of our comments today. So I call this my next generation model. I don't really have a cute name for it yet. But the reason why I had originally put this together was to conceptualize the recruitment of younger board members. But it really is applicable to succession in kind of all different cross sections, ethnicities, trades, ages, etc. Right? And I'll just kind of explain it a bit. The idea is that in order for our organizations to be truly relevant to our community members, we need to make sure that the staffs, the boards, and the committees match the demographics of the target population we're going after. So the easiest way to say this is that if you're a board of directors that has all members who are age 50 plus, and you're looking to engage the next generation, your board is not representative of the target population you're trying to reach. And you can see that dotted line that when your committees are diverse, when your staff is diverse, when your board is diverse, you then begin to make decisions, not just around the programs and events, but even important policy decisions, funding decisions around what programs, activities, and events that you do. And then the great part is that it's a cycle. Once you're able to bring in people on the other side through the pipeline that Lynn had mentioned, through new events that are bringing in new people, new activities, you then now have really your pick of the litter in terms of new people to then bring back onto those committees, staffs, boards, et cetera. And so it becomes a nice little cycle. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus here on the left, because that's typically the question that comes up first. They say, is it a closed cycle? Where do we start? What do we do? I usually encourage people to start with your board. Start with the top down. And so the questions that we're going to do with our deep dive here are going to specifically focus on the board. And the first deep dive area is on specific policies and procedures. So I want to call out John, I want to call out Jeff for this question. There is a saying that your policies match your priorities. So if board succession is truly something that your board is committed to, you also need to have the policies in place that match this commitment. So here is the question. What policies have you implemented or have you seen be implemented on your boards to enable succession? I want to start with John.
Well, I think hopefully, most organizations have this or are thinking about it, but I think term limits are very important. And I think we just have to be honest about the fact that when somebody is on a board and things are operating well, it is difficult to think about succession and transition and to cycle through, bring on new board members. And so I think that the term limit policies at least force the question, force you to look at that, to ask the question about whether or not board members are participating, are they fulfilling their obligations and expectations. It at least forces the organization to have that question and to think critically about, at that moment, what are our needs? What else do we need on this board in order to provide the most diverse, well-rounded group to lead this organization? And so I think that starting with that is, I think it's just a really important part. And, again, I just want to emphasize, it's hard. It's difficult, especially when you have a group, they get along, they work well together. But it is a question about organizational health and how well you're setting yourself up for the future.
So John, before I move over to Jeff, you had mentioned that the term limits really help to do that evaluation at the end of term. Can you speak at all to your thoughts and feelings about that mandatory exit clause? Like, I know a lot of times they say 2 terms and you got to take a break, 1 year, 2 year. Tell us a bit about your perspective on that.
Well, I think every organization views it a little bit differently. I think that, I've been on boards probably longer than I should have. We have board members probably who have been with us longer than they should have. And so I think it's just important that organizations, for their own sustainability, for their own health, to ask this question, to look at this, to make sure that they are thinking critically about new ideas and new perspectives and new sets of skill sets to bring on to organizations. I think that some organizations are very good at cycling people through. Some, support the old school where you have board members who have been on there forever. And we've certainly done both as an organization. And so I think each just has to ask themselves, what are they willing to commit to? What difficult questions are they willing to ask themselves in order to ensure the long sustainability of their organization?
Jeff, let's move over to you. What policies have you implemented or seen to be implemented on your boards to enable succession?
Yeah, I can touch on a couple of things, and usually to some extent it's operating within the existing policies, but perhaps with a little bit more intention and making sure that's clear to others. So, one thing that I know there are some pros and cons to, I mentioned earlier, there are 2 seats on the national board for National Youth Student Council members. I think, Craig, I know I've heard you talk about how problematic it can be to kind of set up these types of youth roles on boards. And I certainly agree. Sometimes organizations can create positions like that and then just say, okay, we've done it, we're good, we can stop there. Or the people in those positions can feel sort of pigeonholed, or that they don't have the same rights or representation as other board members. So I think you have to be careful there, but it has been, I would say, valuable for us in recent years. In finding some folks and giving them exposure to what it's really like to serve on the national board in that way. I think I've looked for opportunities to strengthen existing committees by creating more diverse committees. So, some of our committees, our national committees, we do, just like with the national board, see the same type of folks volunteering or being appointed or reappointed. And so I think it's really important to be intentional at every level of the organization, right? And thinking through how do we make sure we have that kind of mix of diversity that we're looking for in terms of, again, age diversity, skill sets, gender, all of these things that we're looking at. And then like, where can we create new spaces as well? So a young professionals caucus has been formed in JACL in the last few years. That's something where clearly we are looking across the organization. We saw that there was a gap in terms of people who are like in their late 20s and 30s. There wasn't as much distinct programming or spaces set aside. So that was something that was led by young professionals in our organization and created.
Very, very cool. Jeff gave a little bit of a preview to one of the next deep dives in a second when we talk about real trust. But before we move on to that, I'm just going to kind of summarize some of the things that we've seen both presented and that we've heard from our panelists recently. So term limits is, I think, really a key thing that we've heard across the board that is important for boards to think about as they look at succession and they look at transition. Maximum service. And again, John had mentioned you can have that discussion with your board, but I think it's really important to think about that mandatory break clause. And if you don't have it, to still ensure that you're having the conversation around, it's been here for a little bit too long. What kind of space can we open up, even if we don't necessarily have people on the bench? But having the term limits brings up the conversation. And second, Jeff had talked a lot about composition. John had presented a board recruitment matrix that he uses for his organization. We're happy to share a couple links of some generic board recruitment matrices following the session that you can also look to use to look at the diversity of your board, look at the composition, and find your gaps and where you need to recruit. That being said, Jeff, great introduction for the next part. Let's talk a little bit about real trust. And I want to call out Lynn and Jeff for this question. Jeff had mentioned a lot of times we'll pigeonhole people into sort of specific committee roles or kind of specific positions, almost to limit the influence that they have, to say, here's some budget for you, here's sort of a side role for you. But when it comes to real trust, how have you seen real trust implemented with your boards? And also feel free to give some examples of when maybe it wasn't there and why that created problems. I want to start with Lynn first. Lynn, what have you seen?
Thanks, Craig. Yeah, so this is a great example. And I think I didn't realize it at the time, but back in 2012, 2013, that's when we used what we called an advisor position to build this trust. And just like Craig said, what I think is different about that position is it wasn't like sitting at the kids' table. It was not a separate area or a separate, board for young people per se. It was like, come sit at the adults' table. Be a part of this serious organization, and and people like Cyrus, Dave, and Norm were very honest with me, saying that we want you to learn more about this organization. And yes, it's going to be a lot of long meetings, like just heads up. Sometimes this is the not so fun stuff that we have to deal with, but we want you to learn about it. So take this time. And I used that position for about, I wouldn't want to say use. I was in that position about 3 years, just learning about the organization. I had, no idea what the finances were like. Get a peek, get an understanding of that. And so I think that's where trust is built on both sides, right? They trusted me with a certain level of here's the books, here's all of our policies, here's our things that we're struggling with, and I was also able to build trust with them and give my ideas. So I think not making a quote unquote kids table is really important.
Jeff, thoughts?
Yeah, I would just I mentioned clear communication as a takeaway for myself, and I think that's what you need to do to build that trust, right? Being clear and open with folks about what the expectations are, or perhaps what it is you see in them that is, why you're having a conversation with them about stepping up into a leadership role. It's really important, and just having those conversations to make sure that you're in alignment with each other, right? We're talking about board diversity and how important that is, but you also need to make sure that you have that alignment and trust so that you can move forward together as a unit.
Awesome. So when we think about real trust, I think the team here wanted folks to really walk away with this question: is there mobility? So Lynn had mentioned the kids table, right? If your organization has pieces or parts of it that are designated to young people, that can be okay. But if there is no mobility for real decision-making power and trust and influence off of that group at some point in time, then it becomes a kids' table. And to Jeff's point, as they begin to transition off, think about expectations, think about alignment so that both can be on that same page. Okay, I want to remind our panelists we've got about 11 minutes left, so let's try to keep our answers tight because I want to make sure to get through the next couple sections here. But we're going to look on the other side. We're going to look at succession at the top, but on the staff side. And this is for all panelists. The question that actually, in the interest of time, I'm going to keep this to John so we can kind of move on because John, I want to hear your thoughts on this. But what are some things that the existing and new board members need to think about in regards to the relationship between the CEO or executive director and the board of directors? Tell us about your perspective on that.
I think having clear boundaries, having clear roles. I spoke about this earlier, that I think it's really critical for the board to keep themselves operating at a macro level within the organization, and to trust the staff to operate the organization. And I just wanted to mention something that my board actually had started having me do a few years ago during my performance evaluations, where they actually had me come up with a list of potential replacements. And I think that that was actually a really good process to start thinking about, who are people, what are some of the attributes of individuals that I thought the board could consider when and should replace me. So I'll stop there.
Got it. I originally just want, Jeff, let's have you comment on this as well. When you think about that relationship, ED and board, what comes to mind for you?
Yeah, I think like John said previously, don't micromanage. That's so critical. I have trust that David, our ED, is doing his job to the best of his ability, and that he can manage the day to day without the board getting involved in that unless they specifically request some help. The board's job is to interact with the ED so that we have a general sense of how things are going. And I do that, through regular check-ins with him. So I think just really understanding that relationship, understanding the basics between just in good practice, right? Best practices for board governance is where you need to start.
Excellent. So a couple of takeaways from what we've heard in our presentations, what we've heard from the answers right here is we need to understand that split of responsibility. And there's actually the great part is that there are best practices for this. If you look at sites like BoardSource, if you look at any basic nonprofit management book now, the board really has governance responsibilities and the executive director and CEO really run that company. And then to John's point and to Jeff's point, really looking at that balance of power. We've seen situations where it's been either or. We won't go into details, we won't name names, but really kind of being cognizant of being too micromanaging, getting feedback and saying, yeah, this is important. I'm hearing this community. I'm going to communicate that to my ED, but at the same time, I'm also going to trust that they're hearing everything, they're internalizing it, they're taking it, but they're going to act in the best interest of the organization. And that may not necessarily mean taking my idea, right? So let's go ahead and move on. About 8 minutes left here. I think an important topic to cover that is not tactical, but is really emotional. Every human has the need to be needed. Every human has the need to be useful. We want to know that our contributions matter. But sometimes when it comes to transitioning, the loss of power, influence, usefulness, it can be a little bit jarring. And so in the interest of time, I'm just going to do Jeff first, and then I'll kind of gauge time from there. But Jeff, what has been your experience with this, and how do you have a hard conversation around transition?
Well, again, I'm going to assume that you've done the work to build some trust so that you can have the hard conversation. Otherwise, it's probably not going to go very well for you. But I think when I ran for national president, I just tried to be really open about some of the issues that I was seeing, and to check in with other folks, right, and say, this is my perspective. Is that what you're seeing as well? And that's how I try to arrive at some of these harder topics, right? I mean, again, JCL, we're 91 years old. There's no shame in the fact that as an older organization, there are some things that could be cleaned up, right? There are some things that we need to do to adapt to be more modern. And I was, always willing to call that out in a way that sometimes is uncomfortable for folks, right? But because folks knew me, because that we had built that trusting relationship, I could have those types of hard conversations.
And Lynn, let's get a bit of your perspective too. Tell us a little bit about what it's been like to have some of those conversations.
Yeah, I think for us it's really interesting because we change presidents every year, which means we have many past presidents, and I think we have to we are working on trying to create space for our past presidents to be involved, yet not micromanage. And I think that's always going to be a balance, and sometimes that might be some hard conversations. But how do we transition, right? Like all of our wonderful past presidents that we have, to rely on them for advice, but at the same time, we can't, consult 20, 30 people on every decision that we make. It's just not feasible. And so I think knowing that, keeping that in mind, creating space, I think, for our past presidents and leaders, especially as a young past, I'm going to be one of the younger past presidents, right? And acknowledging my own having to step off, right? Having to transition off, meaning my influence will be passing from one to another, is really important for us to have maybe those hard conversations amongst ourselves as past presidents of the organization. Not meaning that the leaders coming up won't value our opinions, but there's definitely a need for that conversation to have. And I think somebody had asked about what are symptoms of unsustainable practices. And I think if you're too top heavy, at the end where you have so many quote unquote, and I don't want to use the word advisors because it's actually a board position for us, but there's so many people you need to consult before making a decision that'll kind of make it difficult for the everyday operations. And so that's something that I think is another tough conversation that needs to happen.
Thank you, Lynn. So we've put just a few summary items here, right? I think bullet point number 2, which really does have to do a lot with ego, I think is typically the one that's hardest to swallow, right? Is when it comes to influence, there may be a loss. And I think accepting that is important. And we're going to kind of cover what accepting means. It also means passing on your legacy. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. But because we're out of time, panelists, if you'll allow me, I'm just going to go ahead and summarize the other slides very quickly here, because we wanted to at some point talk about the programs, events, activities. In summary, Lynn had mentioned this before, but creating a pipeline is very important, right? Thinking about a succession and a continuum of activities to be able to generate new leadership, to be able to find new faces, and to find new talent is very important. We're going to, of course, send these slides out after so that you can see some of these tips and tricks for yourself. But I'm going to go ahead and close things out in the last 3 minutes here. If you are interested in learning and reading more, I'll go ahead and paste in a couple of links into the chat in just a minute. But we did publish a few articles. Well, there they are. Thank you. We have a couple articles here that dive a little bit into that history because we glossed over it in the beginning. One that talks a little bit more about leadership succession and some of the nuances with it. But I want to thank and give a huge thank you to the panelists. Jeff, I think the transformation that you've seen with JECL as a 91-year-old organization has been incredible. I think that when you're 91, you'll look back on your career here and say, damn, I did a great job. So want to say thank you for participating. John, I do want to say that you have been a constant when it comes to the future of this community. I'm here because of you. Many of the folks around us are here because of you. And so we thank you. And Lynn, just listening to others like Norman who have described you, you are the bright star. You're the tip of the spear for the HUA, along with folks like Courtney, for both the organization and the greater Hawaii community. So panelists, thank you, thank you, thank you. And for those who are watching, I would like to remind you and everyone of our next upcoming public symposium happening today. It is on philanthropy leadership. It's looking at a historical reconciliation and looking at today's landscape. The description I have here says, this dialogue will focus on the historical role of public and private funders in strengthening the US-Japan ties through creating philanthropic institutions and the global and social trends that are directing foundational giving and nonprofit missions today. So another focus on nonprofits. We hope to see everyone there. The link is in your email boxes. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been a pleasure. It has been, actually, I'm supposed to stop my screen here, but it has been a pleasure. It has been an honor to be here today. You know, I know that when we think about the future of our organizations, it really depends on this transition that we have. And I know that that can be difficult, but what I'm hoping is that folks can kind of think of it in a little bit of a different perspective. For you as leaders who have spent a lifetime building our community's most critical organizations, when you transition, you're passing on your legacy. And so in Japanese, we have this word that's okage-sama de, which means I'm here because of you. And so it is because of you that the next generation has become involved, inspired, and engaged. It is because of you that this new generation of leaders is here. And so your work is your legacy. Pass that legacy on, and we'll build a bright future together. Thank you so much, everyone. We'll see you next time. Hope everyone has a great day.